their way into the northwest, but high pressure in the southeast is keeping them at bay, and so southeastern areas of England starting off the day on a calmer note, but also a foggier one as well. We do have some quite dense patches of freezing fog around across eastern areas of England, so do just take care if you are out travelling first thing. They will eventually clear their way off to allow some brighter spells later on into the afternoon. The cloud, though, is going to persist across the northwest with a more persistent band of rain into Northern Ireland and areas of Scotland as well. It's going to stay milder, though, here in the northwest, so highs around 9, maybe even 10 degrees across the Western Isles, but underneath the brighter yet clearer skies further towards the southeast, only really 3 or 4 degrees here. And it's under those clearing skies where we'll see a frost redevelop tonight, getting as low as -6, -7 degrees in the most prone rural locations. The cloud that's now filtered its way into western areas of England and Wales will hold back the frost a bit more here, but there could be some areas of rain and drizzle still persisting. The mildest temperatures overnight still going to be in the far northwest, holding up around 7 degrees Celsius here. As we move throughout Monday, it is a relatively similar picture, still with that northwest-southeast split. We might just see a slight ingress of the cloud across continental Europe just push its way into Kent and areas of East Anglia, but the greatest chance of seeing those sunnier spells is going to be across that central slice of England. Again, though, in the southeast, we've got the colder air intact, so we'll only be around 3 or 4 degrees Celsius by daytime, but much milder in the northwest, highs of 9 or 10 degrees. The cloud will eventually sink its way southwards throughout the rest of this week, so by the time we get to Wednesday, it might just turn that bit milder in southern areas of England as well. Have a good day.
I'm Michael Portillo. Join me on GB News on a Sunday morning for topical discussion, debate, arts and culture, and sometimes even some ethical dilemmas.
I don't always agree with you, Michael.
Michael Portillo, Sundays on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
We are GB News, and we'd like to say thank you to each and every one of you for bringing us your conversations, for helping our great nation find its voice. We are here for you on radio, television and online, across England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland.
It's not the BBC, you actually get your facts right.
We are proud to be GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates.
Do you not believe in prison?
I don't believe in prison.
I'm completely stunned.
I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
My name's Tom Harwood and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today.
I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
And the national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
We are GB News, right across the nation. You can get us on television, on radio, on digital. We're absolutely everywhere.
Amazing! You see, amazing!
You remind me of me in the European Parliament.
But here's the most important bit. We are not part of the mainstream establishment. We think and speak just like you do. We are the People's Channel.
Magnificent. That's really, really thoughtful.
Come and join us on GB News, the People's News Channel.
Join me, Nana Akua, Saturday and Sunday afternoons on GB News. Expect fiery debate and passionate discussion as me and my panel tackle some of the biggest topics hitting the headlines. It's a place for everyone's opinion. No one gets cancelled, but no one gets an easy ride.
Oh, she's on it today!
Be ready for conversations that are fierce, frank, and of course, fun. Every Saturday and Sunday afternoon from 4 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
And right across the United Kingdom.
You can find us on Sky Channel 512.
Virgin Media Channel 604.
Freesat Channel 216.
Freeview Channel 236.
And YouView Channel 236.
You can also take us with you on DAB Plus Radio.
With the GB News app and at the website gbnews.uk.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Coming up on today's show, I'm going to be discussing terror, Ukraine and China with former MI6 boss Sir Richard Dearlove. I'll also be joined by Foreign Secretary James Cleverly to discuss some of the tales of Tory sleaze in today's papers. And Labour's Pat McFadden, Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury, will be discussing their party's plans for tax and spend. But first, here's the news headlines with Aaron Armstrong.
Good morning, it's 9:30. I'm Aaron Armstrong in the GB newsroom. Labour's calling for an investigation into claims the BBC chairman helped Boris Johnson arrange a loan of up to £800,000 weeks before the then Prime Minister recommended him for the job. It follows a report in the Sunday Times that claims Tory donor Richard Sharp was involved in talks about financing Mr Johnson when he found himself in financial difficulty in late 2020. A spokesperson for the former Prime Minister has dismissed the report as rubbish. Richard Sharp insists there was no conflict of interest. US investigators have found more classified documents during a 12-hour search of President Joe Biden's home in Delaware. Some of them were from Mr Biden's time as senator and others from his role as vice president to Barack Obama. A special counsel's been appointed to investigate how the president has handled sensitive documents. Buckingham Palace has revealed the details for the coronation later this year. The historic event will take place at Westminster Abbey on the 6th of May. A concert will be held at Windsor Castle the following day, featuring what the palace have called global music icons. Thousands of events are expected to take place all over the UK, with a bank holiday declared for Monday the 8th. TV online and DAB Plus Radio, this is GB News. Now back to Camilla Tominey.
Well, good morning on this very frosty and cold Sunday morning. I feel that this week has been a bit emblematic of the topsy-turvy nature of our political scene. We've had Rishi Sunak, a Tory Prime Minister, suggest that the idea of tax cuts might be idiotic. We've had the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, saying that he prefers Davos and rubbing shoulders with multi-millionaires to being in Westminster. And we've had a number of left-wing men in Parliament having a go at women for standing up for equality. What's going on there? We'll be discussing that and more over the next 90 minutes. We're going to bring in my paper reviewer in just a moment, Jenni Murray, former host of BBC's Woman's Hour and a Daily Mail columnist. But first, let's just go through the headlines. There's a bit of a mixed bag this morning. The Sunday Times goes with, it's like the First World War. If we kill them, they're just replaced, which is a report from Ukraine. Also a story on Boris Johnson. BBC boss helped arrange Johnson's £800,000 loan in Downing Street. Astonishing story. On the Observer front page, we've got Zahawi fights for his political life after admitting tax error. That story's picked up in a lot of the papers today. Sunday Telegraph headline, refugees and NHS at heart of diverse coronation. That's a key theme we're going to be discussing in just a moment. Front of the Mail on Sunday, quite the splash. Andrew's bid to overturn sex abuse deal. That's a story that's also in The Sun. Got the Mirror here, Sunday Mirror. Harry spun a tale over tailspin. That's to suggest that a story in his book Spare has been rather overblown by the Duke of Sussex. Sunday Express, King wants coronation to bring joy. That's been briefed by Buckingham Palace last night, so it makes a lot of the papers this morning. And as I said, The Sun on Sunday, again using that story of the Duke of York, Andrew plots Virginia U-turn. Right, let's bring in Jenni Murray now. Jenni, thank you so much for joining me this morning. It's actually a really mixed bag of papers with some really good stories.
Yeah, very, very strange. Now, we've known for a long time that Boris Johnson is often short of money and needs some help and all of that. The surprising thing about this is that he wanted an £800,000 loan.
Yes.
And so he asked for help from Richard Sharp, who became subsequently being the operative word, the chairman of the BBC.
I mean, this is a Sunday Times story. It follows on from another report about him needing people to guarantee loans because he was in dire financial straits after his divorce, I think, from Marina Wheeler. But the idea that Sharp gets the post of chairman of the BBC after this.
After helping with the £800,000, because Charles Moore was considered to be the number one.
Former editor of the Telegraph.
Of course, from the Telegraph. That didn't happen, and Richard Sharp did get the job. Now, the BBC has nothing to do with who appoints the chairman.
Sure.
But the Prime Minister does.
And he was, at the time, I think, Mr Sharp, regarded as somewhat of a shoo-in. So it looks a little murky, let's put it that way.
It looks very, very murky to me. I keep thinking of the word impartiality. What? Oh, yes. You know, we've heard a lot of that from the BBC, but did it apply here? I don't know. Now, the other financial story, which is, I have to say, completely baffled me, is the Nadim Zahawi story. He has said he was simply careless.
Not deliberate.
Who is careless when it comes to tax? You know, when I first went freelance many, many years ago, I had some very good advice from a senior colleague who'd been freelance for a long time and looking after his own tax affairs. And he said, Jenny, let me tell you one thing. Mess with anybody, but never, ever mess with the Inland Revenue.
But the extraordinary thing is he was Chancellor at the time that he paid back this fine. He paid the tax and then he paid a fine. He was Chancellor for a very brief moment. It's extraordinary, this, isn't it?
How could somebody with supposedly that financial knowledge be careless with his tax? You know, it's obvious. It's a very complicated story. It's a company that it seems he and his father were involved in.
Going into the weeds would take too long.
Goodness knows what happened.
The optics, Jenny, are appalling for him. And I think he's, you know, people are asking him to consider his position as party chairman, and probably rightly so. Follow-up story of the weekend. I'd be really interested in your take on this, because we have seen in Parliament some extraordinary scenes of a Labour MP, Rosie Duffield, shouted down, and then Miriam Cates, who's on the Tory side, both women standing up for women's equality, being shouted down in the House by men. And now we hear that one of Keir Starmer's aides tried to say that Rosie Duffield, who's in his own party, should, quote, spend less time hanging out with J.K. Rowling.
They don't like us, do they? All these men. You know, they try to say they're not misogynist, but actually, I think at the root of it, they are. Because this debate is really, really serious, and I've been involved in it for quite some time. I keep getting called a TERF.
Yeah, you're a TERF for standing up for women's rights. Yes, exactly. I think anybody that stands up for women's rights these days is sullied like that.
Because, you know, what's worrying about this Scottish bill is somebody's called it, does it mean there'll be a Gretna Green for the trans community?
Yeah. And this is a gender recognition bill which suggests that people can self-identify without necessarily having any medical interventions, and it also allows children as young as 16 to self-identify.
That's the most worrying, because 16-year-olds need safeguarding.
Yes.
You know, at the moment it's 18. You can't change your gender until you're 18. 16-year-olds have done it in the past, and we know from Keira Bell,
who
came out 2 or 3 years ago, just how damaging it was.
She regretted transitioning from female to male, and she took hormones, and now it's irreversible.
Deeply regretted it, and had a double mastectomy, and that is not reversible.
No.
And then in her 20s realised, no, she was a woman. And, you know, we have to safeguard children, and we have to safeguard women. I think those of us, whether it's J.K. Rowling or Rosie Duffield, all of us who have really fought hard to get this properly discussed, would have been much more open to the needs of trans women if they hadn't been so aggressive about their campaign.
And we've seen some footage from the protests with sort of trans women shouting in women's faces.
Saying they want to kill us, all kinds of horrible things, but also changing the language. You know, when they said, no, don't call them breasts, call them chests. And all
chest feeding and
all of that stuff.
People who menstruate, etc.
And we just had to say, no, these are our words, this is our sex.
And
you can't change your biological sex.
Very briefly on that, Jenny, there was a headline, I think it was the Mail on Thursday, saying Labour has a woman problem. Do you agree with that?
Do you know, a lot of my friends who have been Labour supporters all their lives have been saying to me, what are we going to do at the next election? Who am I?
Politically lost.
Politically lost.
Let's quickly move on to the next one, just because time is pressing, as is ever the case. Telegraph front page, refugees and NHS at the heart of a diverse coronation. It's interesting, this. Obviously, the King wants to make it more inclusive and diverse than it would have been in 1953, which is no bad thing.
No, I watched it on the telly in 1953. It may astonish you to know that
it does astonish
I was
me.
actually
Don't look old enough, Jenny.
Well, I am. I was 3 years old when the Queen was...
And do you remember it quite clearly?
My dad was an electrician in a local television shop. He mended televisions. He went on to become an engineer. But we were the only people in our street who consequently had a telly.
Wow.
The entire street came into our front room.
How wonderful.
We were so crowded because it wasn't a very big house. And we watched the Queen be crowned. And I just thought it was amazing, and I've loved her ever since. From that
Do you
day.
love the King as much?
Well, I interviewed him once, and I liked him very much. Actually, Camilla, I should call her the Queen Consort now.
Yes,
I've met her several times.
I mean, she
and
got a lot of stick
her
from Prince Harry in his book. Do you think that was deserved?
No. Absolutely not, that silly little boy.
Jenny.
Sorry, I shouldn't be quite so dismissive, but why not? I am dismissive of him. No, she's terrific, and he is going to ensure that she is crowned alongside him. So it's going to be a diverse coronation. There's going to be lots of excitement. What did he say he wanted it to be? He wanted to be something that would light up the nation.
Yes.
And oh boy, does this nation
and
need...
leave a legacy, because he's got a plan there for the big help out, I think, which is going to take place on the Monday of the weekend, where he wants people to volunteer, and he hopes that might set in train people doing a bit more for their communities.
And we do need the nation lit up right now.
Yes, we do. We need the boost, don't we, in May?
We do.
You chose for opinion piece of the day in the Telegraph, Suella Braverman's, her op-ed on police reform. Now, is it going to be enough? I'm going to be speaking to Palm Sandu a little later in the show, a former officer with the Met Police, to talk about this horrific David Carrick case. I mean, the reputation of the police right now, regardless of any of the Home Secretary's efforts, is at an all-time low. How can it be repaired?
She's saying she hopes to make getting rid of bad policemen easier. She's going to review police dismissals. Why so late? We have known what's been going on for a very long time.
I mean, this bloke was nicknamed, I won't say it because it's breakfast telly, but B something Dave. So he had this reputation for being a complete wrong-un within the ranks, and he stays in this job for 20 years. There was the most extraordinary testimony from one of his victims in the Mail yesterday, a double-page spread, which the Deputy Chief Reporter had done. This woman's experience at the hands of this monster was one of the most disturbing pieces of copy I've read in a long time. But to make matters worse, he remained in uniform throughout.
It's astonishing, isn't it? And we know that, you know, Mr. Riley has been saying, oh, it's terribly difficult to dismiss them.
Yeah,
why is it difficult to dismiss them? Just sack them. You know, since Sarah Everard, what did I read this morning? There have been 16 Met officers convicted since Sarah Everard's murder. And yet still, the Home Secretary is saying, oh, well, we need to review this, we need to make it better. We've heard it all before.
Do you think it has an effect as well on women's safety? We already know that women don't feel particularly safe at night. Do you think it erodes generally women's faith in the police, not least when we've got things like rape convictions at an all-time low?
Well, when the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police says he cannot guarantee that if you go to the police to say you've been attacked, you've been raped, you've had some sort of sexual attack, he can't guarantee that the person, the man you're reporting to, is someone who has never committed a sexual crime. That is terrifying. Who do you go to if you can't trust the police?
No, I know. And I think that's one of the reasons why Carrick was able to get away with so much. I mean, the lady who spoke to the Mail under the conditions of anonymity basically said that her father had been a police officer and she trusted him because he was a copper, because he was in uniform, and kept on making pledges that he would protect her. Actually, he subjected her to the most degrading and inhumane treatment I've ever read about.
Locked in a cupboard. It was unbelievable. Unbelievable what he did to her.
Another theme of the weekend's papers, as you would expect, is the NHS. And there's this extraordinary picture that you've chosen for photo of the day. Let's just take a look at it now. Now, this is, I believe, an NHS doctor lying down with all of the paperwork that he needs to fill out in order to discharge a patient from hospital. And I think the doctor looks like he's a good 6 foot, and he is dwarfed by this paperwork. Jenni, have you ever seen anything like it in your life?
Well, I actually was once on the board of an NHS hospital, and we struggled and struggled and struggled as it became more and more bureaucratic, more and more difficult. The demands from all the different associations that have something to say about the way the NHS, whether it's the Confederate or this or that, it was horrific, because the only thing that mattered to all of us on the board and to all the doctors that we knew was we need to be treating patients.
Yes.
We need
Not
to be
filling out
treating
forms.
patients quickly, not filling out forms, and yet still it's going on.
But I thought it's such a good way of demonstrating
It's
that.
a very
Imagine
good
you're trying to
picture.
treat patients, but you're also doing all of that bureaucracy. It's total madness. Jenni Murray, thank you so much for joining me this morning.
pleasure.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Well, as you know, we've got a people's panel, and today it's going to be in Southend, sunny Southend by the seaside. Olivia Utley's there now. Olivia, what are people talking about in Southend this morning?
Hello, yes, I'm here in beautiful Southend on this lovely sunny morning, and I'm here with the People's Panel of GB News viewers. I will be asking them what they make of the biggest issues facing Britain in 2023, and I'll be giving them a chance to grill the politicians on this show, the politicians they elected. And this is Sam. Sam has been working at this wonderful Ocean Beach cafe for the last 16 years, so knows the area well. And Sam, how's business going for you at the moment?
To be honest with you, it's going quite well at the moment. It's very steady, but that's due to obviously where the cafe is situated. And obviously we've got a very busy residential area around us, and we have a lot of local support as well.
That's great to hear. Are there any concerns you have for the business in this year?
I think a lot of businesses in this area and a lot of businesses obviously in the UK at the moment are struggling, obviously with the gas and electric prices. So obviously they do have to put their prices up, and it is a family-run business, and they don't want to do this, but they don't really have a choice.
Absolutely. Well, thanks very much, Sam. And it's great to see the cafe doing so well.
Thank you.
And I'll introduce you now to our People's Panel. First up, we've got Diana, and Diana's a nurse living here in Southend. And you voted for all the parties in your time. What do you think are the most pressing issues facing the government today?
Well, the health and social care system is completely broken. We've got student nurses qualifying, and now they're in debt before they've even qualified, basically. So they've got money they haven't got any money to keep going with. But the basic principle is we've got patients in beds that can actually be released into social care, but there is no social care either, so I want to know what the government is going to do about relieving that issue and obviously giving the staff for the NHS and the ambulance service more money.
Thank you very much, Diana. And Edward, you're a solicitor here in Southend as well. obviously Rishi Sunak has a pretty full inbox coming into 2023. What do you think should be his top priority?
Well, where do you start? It just seems at the moment that the answer to all of the government's woes is more public spending. There's more spending here, there and everywhere at the moment, and it's being funded by ever higher taxes. There doesn't really seem to be any stopping it at the moment, and this is from a Conservative government that's meant to be a low-tax government. So I'd really like to see an effort made on reforming how the tax is spent, and also a commitment to lower taxes in the future.
Great, thank you very much, Edward. I'm sure you're not alone there. And last but not least, we've got Matt. Matt is a teacher of English and classics. And Matt, you are a Tory party member, but you're feeling a bit disillusioned at the moment.
That's correct, yeah.
What do you think's gone wrong with the country?
Well, I'd like to know when basic needs became luxuries, because it feels to me at the moment that we're paying for everything far too much, far too expensive. I have anxiety putting the heating on. Because I can see it going up and up and up and up. And my wife and I are working, both of us, full-time. We have a 5-year-old daughter, and I want to know at what point we can see the light at the end of the tunnel. Because really, we've got a government, in my view, that is at best incompetent and has mismanaged the economy. At worst, corrupt. And that's my biggest concern.
Well, thank you very much, Matt, and those are deeply worrying concerns that we're hearing there. Big challenge on the government's hands. Let's hear soon what James Cleverly has to say, but first let's go back to Camilla in the studio.
Thank you very much for that, Olivia, in Southend. It looks nice to be beside the seaside. If you want to apply to our People's Panel for a future week, you go to gbnews.uk/panel. The whole point of this, by the way, is that we don't make the show too Westminster-centric, because you're all watching from around the country, so why not represent you from around the country? I note that some of our competitors have been borrowing the idea of including the audience. Why broadcasters haven't thought of this novel notion of actually asking the public what they think until now completely baffles me. Now, Olivia's talked about the fact that we are having James Cleverly on. We're waiting for him to come on the line. He's on the media rounds. He's doing a series of interviews. We wait for him to come in. In the meantime, I'm going to bring Jenni Murray back in, my paper reviewer. She's a Daily Mail columnist. She was also host of Women's Hour for how many years, Jenni?
Oh, 33.
33? Less for murder, honestly.
It was very strange getting up at 5:30 this morning to come here.
I know, like
I used to do
blast
that
from the past.
all the time. And when I left Women's Hour, I said, right, that's it. I'll never get up at 5:30 in the morning again. But I did.
Here you are. Well, thank you for getting up for GB News. That's very kind of you. I just wondered, with all of your wealth of broadcasting experience, what you made of the state of politics, and specifically Rishi Sunak and Starmer. Do you rate Rishi Sunak, first of all?
Well, I do have some sympathy with him being in the back of a car without a seatbelt on.
Right.
It's something that I hate, sitting in the back of the car with a seatbelt on. I do it.
I know, but if you were being filmed.
I know. He should have thought about it. His advisors should have thought about it. You're in the back of a car, Rishi. Just put your seatbelt on. That was silly. So I think, little things like that, very bad.
But do you prefer him to Boris and Truss?
Well, Truss, I don't think there's any point in even thinking about whether I liked her.
Well, it was so short-lived.
It was such a mess. The whole
and
thing
what
was
do you
such
think
a
about
mess.
Starmer? Because the party seems popular, but not the man.
Well, Starmer, I knew when he was DPP, Director of Public Prosecutions, and he was very, very good at it. He was really on all the difficult questions that women were facing. He really knew what he was talking about, and he took it all very seriously. What I can't understand about him, obviously the women question, the trans women question, is a big one for me. I simply cannot understand why the leader of the Labour Party can't just clearly say he knows what a woman is.
Yes. He has prevaricated on that issue of, can a woman have a penis? He doesn't seem to be able to give a straight answer to that pretty simple question.
Why can't they just be straight and say, look, I know what a woman is and I know what a trans woman is. Let's be clear about the terminology here. A woman cannot, in my long experience, have a penis. Have you ever come across that?
No. Look, I think Is there something wrong with the fact that this particular issue, which is a marginal issue for many people, and it's dominating so much of the news agenda?
Stonewall have been incredible because their influence has been huge. You know, I first wrote about this, I think it was 6 years ago, when I began to read that trans activists were saying, no, we can't call it breastfeeding, it's chest feeding, and changing the language and influencing the NHS. I'll tell you what struck me last week. I watched a new ITV series called Maternal, and I thought, gosh, this is really interesting.
Yes.
It's about 3 women doctors going back to work, and suddenly calling a series Maternal feels like a really powerful political statement, because maternity has been removed from so much of the NHS. And if our words and our functions are to be taken away, it's not a small issue. It's a big issue.
Do you feel for the kind of feminist movement? I mean, you were at the forefront of that for many years, and there is a sense that it's not just women's rights that are being erased, but women themselves with some of this language and terminology?
Well, that's what I mean. You know, when you call a series Maternal, and
that's a rarity.
Oh gosh, that's surprising. How very brave of them to do that.
But what about younger women as well, Jenni? Because there's a generational divide here. We have a section on the show called Generation Gap, and, you know, older women do have a different attitude, it seems, to younger people in their 20s and 30s who do want to be inclusive. I mean, nobody's talking against inclusivity.
I have never spoken against inclusivity. I've always said what I said to you earlier, that if only there were respect on both sides, that would be fine. I am perfectly happy to respect the trans woman.
What we need is agreeable disagreement. Thank you, Jenni.
Absolutely.
Well, we're going to be speaking to James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary, after this.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Deebs & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Mark Stein. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
Here on GB News Live, we'll be keeping you in the picture, finding out what's happening across the country and finding out why it matters to you. We'll have the facts fast with our team of reporters and specialist correspondents. Wherever it's happening, we'll be there from 12 noon on TV, radio and online. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
Why not take us home with you by visiting the GB News shop at gbnews.store. You'll find all the official merchandise, a really good present actually for yourself, your friends or your family.
We ship across the UK mainland at no extra cost. GB News, the People's Channel.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch.
You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh my goodness, brilliant. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Monday to Thursday on GB News, it's Bev Turner Today from 10 a.m. We're going to be here for you, our GB News family, to keep you up to date, but also make you smile.
The guy went from puberty to adultery.
And I can't wait to bring a few of my own opinions.
I have no time for cultural totalitarianism.
We'll engage in passionate, but always polite debate, with your thoughts and opinions at the centre of it all. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
Join me every Sunday at 6 p.m. for Gloria Meets. In exclusive interviews, I'll be finding out who our politicians really are and what they really think.
It's something that you would never want anyone to suffer.
I didn't know what channels there were. I didn't think I'd be believed.
I must have weighed about 7 stone and I'm 5'8".
My instincts was to sort of cover this up. I mean, clearly that was a mistake.
Join me every Sunday at 6 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by 2 of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other paper review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
Welcome back. Well, I'm delighted to be joined by James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary. Can you hear me, Mr. Cleverly?
I can indeed. I can indeed.
Wonderful. Thanks for joining us this morning. Look, there's some tales in the papers today which suggest a degree of Tory sleaze. We've got Boris Johnson's finances once again under scrutiny. We've got Nadhim Zahawi in this strange position of having to pay a fine of more than £1 million to HMRC while he was briefly Chancellor. Also in the week, we've had the Prime Minister fined for not wearing a seatbelt in the back of the car. It's not been a great week for the government, has it?
Well, I think that most people would recognise that the Prime Minister failing to wear his seatbelt was a small error whilst he was recording a video about a very important announcement for government funding to some of the most deprived parts of the UK. And with regard to Nadhim Zahawi, I think it's worth remembering that the whole reason that that we are having a discussion is because he has been a very successful entrepreneur who built a business from nothing, employing hundreds of people, possibly even 1,000 or more people, and has successfully contributed to the British economy. And he paid tax, the business paid tax, his employees paid tax. And HMRC said that he was careless in the administration of his tax affairs, but he is now fully up to date with the taxes that he owes.
Should he sack his accountant, or should he be sacked then?
Well, I don't know any more details than what he has already put in the public domain. I don't think it would be right or proper for me to speculate or guess about any further details about his tax affairs. But he has been a successful entrepreneur, building a company which has paid tax, employing people who have paid taxes, and he has himself paid tax, a considerable amount, because he's been successful.
But the Prime Minister hasn't sort of spoken up in support of him, so is he still secure in his position as party chairman?
Well, I think the Prime Minister has been supportive of him, and I think it's worth... I mean, he is in that role because he has demonstrated, as I say, not just that he's been a very successful businessman, but we should remember he was the head of the vaccine task force, which was about the rollout...
Well, he's a successful businessman, but he's not been a very successful politician, has he? Because he's marred in controversy now.
No, I think quite the opposite. I think his time as vaccine minister actually demonstrated that the experience that he developed in business and in other ministerial roles was useful.
Do you have confidence in him as party chairman?
Well, look, appointments to the government in whatever capacity are for the Prime Minister. This is not for me to start acting out as if I were the... Look, I'm not going to start play acting being Prime Minister. The Prime Minister has appointed his cabinet. It's for the Prime Minister to decide how long any of us stay in his role. Now, as I
so are you not backing him, just to be clear?
What I'm saying is I'm not going to play act being Prime Minister. It is for the Prime Minister to decide whether I or anyone else remains in his cabinet.
You mentioned the Levelling Up Fund there. 2/3 of the money have gone to Tory seats. Is this about levelling up, or is it about shoring up the Tories' finances in constituencies because you're worried about losing the next general election?
When you say that, it's worth remembering that the majority of constituencies in the country, by definition, are Conservative-held constituencies, including, after the 2019 general election, a significant number of constituencies who are who have for decades been economically struggling. Some of the poorer constituencies and some of the poorer communities in this country, they turned to the Conservatives because they had felt that for too long, particularly under Labour governments, they were ignored and overlooked. So it is absolutely right and proper that we rebalance how we distribute money around the country so that those poor communities
aren't poor people saying, Mr. Cleverly, that they're taxed too much? I mean, I understand what you're doing with regard to levelling up in particular seats, but we've got some polling in the Telegraph this morning which suggests that 49% of the public think the tax burden is too high, and that when they're asked who they should trust on improving the economy, 49% think Labour, just 23% think the Tories. So the Tories have lost their mantle as a low-tax party. Doesn't that worry you as a committed party man?
Well, of course, all of us would like to bring taxes down. The Prime Minister has said he would like to bring taxes down, but we've got to do it at a point in time when it is right. And for those people who are suffering under the delusion that a Labour government would bring taxes down, I think need to be reminded of what the lessons of history have taught us all. The Conservatives put taxes up when we have to in order to make sure the economic situation is stable. Labour put up taxes whenever they think they can get away with it. That is the difference between an inherently low-tax party like mine and an inherently high-tax party like the Labour Party. No, not at all. Is it idiotic for people to want tax cuts? It's the most sensible thing in the world. No, of course it's the most sensible thing in the world.
But there was a suggestion from the Prime Minister that only an idiot wouldn't understand the current global headwinds and call for tax cuts, even though we know from the Bank of England Governor, Andrew Bailey, that there is some more fiscal headroom. There's 11 billion more fiscal headroom than we thought we had. So why can't people at least expect for some of the tax rises that are scheduled in April to be cancelled?
We will always make economic decisions that we believe are in the best interest of the people of this country. The tax level that we put in place is to make sure that we're able to fund the public services that we all rely upon. But in every part of our decision making, we, uniquely in British politics at the moment, when you look at the attitude of the Lib Dems, the SNP, the Labour Party, all of whom are inherently, instinctively, tribally high tax parties, we tax at the level that we need to provide for public services and no more. And when there are the opportunities to ease the tax burden on those hardworking families, we seek to do so. That is in stark difference to those inherently high tax parties that might form a government in the future if people don't recognise the importance of the work we're doing to rebalance the economy.
We look forward to taxes at some point coming down. Foreign Secretary James Cleverly, thank you so much for joining me this morning. Now, from blue to red, I'm joined by Pat McFadden in the studio, Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury. Now, I'm confused by Labour's economic policy because we've got Keir Starmer making some pretty big spending pledges. We've got Wes Streeting talking about giving nurses perhaps a 10% pay rise. And yet at the same time, there's lots of rhetoric around, oh, we can't throw too much money at it. We've got to be mindful of the purse strings. So what are Labour going to do then? Raise taxes to afford the spending or cut the spending?
The principle will be if we come forward with new spending, we'll say how we'll pay for it. So let me give you an example. You mentioned Wes Streeting there. We've identified staffing shortages as being part of a big long-term problem in the NHS. There's no secret about that. So we've got a plan to train more doctors, train more district nurses in particular.
All of which costs money.
And we've said we'll pay for that through the abolition of the non-dom tax loophole.
Although there's an argument that that won't make enough money to pay for all that.
Well, we think it will raise $3 billion a year, but let me just set out the general principle here. It's my job as Shadow Chief Secretary to make sure that our colleagues don't make unfunded spending commitments and things where people are hinting or whatever, and we haven't identified the money. Those things won't make the manifesto. Our manifesto will be based on a programme where we say how it's going to be funded.
But there's a costing on things like giving nurses a 10% rise, making GPs salaried, phasing out the sale of cigarettes, guaranteeing free childcare, keeping the freeze to fuel duty in place. If you did add all that up, it would be 54 billion quid.
So let's take this
dossier. 45 billion
let's
quid.
take this little dossier that was issued by the Tory party this week. First of all, we haven't promised put a percentage on the nurses' pay rise. Secondly, for example, the fuel duty thing that you mentioned there, we do think the government should freeze the fuel duty, and this could be funded through the headroom that's there, which has been identified since last November. And I was pretty surprised when the Tory party issued this dossier saying that there's all these unfunded spending commitments.
Yeah.
The River Thames will run red if Labour gets in. And do you know what they did the very next day? They hinted they were going to do the same thing.
I know, but I think people are still confused. I mean, they understand the Labour rhetoric.
Is it a terrible thing or is it a good thing?
But what is the Labour position? OK, then, let's look at it this way. The tax burden's at an all-time high. It's gone up from 33% to 39% of GDP since the pandemic. Are you going to come in and cut taxes then? Are you going to do what Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt refused to do?
You can't say on individual taxes 2 years out. If you look at the change in the position from November to the March budget we've had, that's just a period of just 4 months. It looks like between those 4 months, there might be £10 billion or more headroom than the Chancellor thought in November.
But is Labour's inclination just to see the headroom and spend it immediately? I mean, that's kind of knee-jerk. Labour gets money and they spend it.
If you kept fuel duty at the current rate it is at the moment, that's putting money in people's pockets effectively compared to the 12p a litre rise that would come otherwise. So we understand the pressure families are under at the moment, the pressure households are under through inflation and energy price rises and so on. So we think there is the room to do that. But the broader position which you're driving at is where we say we'll do something, we will say how it's going to be paid for.
Well, let me move on to a different subject then and see if you can give me a straight answer on this. Has Labour got a woman problem? What did you make of some of your colleagues' behaviour in the House of Commons earlier this week? Lloyd Russell-Moyle and Ben Bradshaw both shouting down female MPs for standing up for women's rights. That was wrong, wasn't it?
We don't have a women problem. We've got
Well, you do, because Rosie Duffield, one of your own MPs, says you do.
We've got fantastic, strong women in the Labour Party. I work for one, Rachel Reeves, our Shadow Chancellor.
Should these women be shouted down in the House, then?
But to go to the second part of what you said, no, she shouldn't have been, of course not. People, you should be able to give their view.
Shouldn't Lloyd Russell-Moyle be disciplined then? It wasn't just his rhetoric in the House. He then quite bizarrely went and sat on the Tory benches, very close to Miriam Cates, who had made a point about women's rights and safe spaces for women, in a bid to intimidate her. That is appalling and disgraceful behaviour in the House, isn't it?
You know, I do not know what he was doing, crossing the floor of the House to, you know, as your viewers will know, and there's the opposition side and the government side, you don't do that. I don't know what he was doing.
What should happen to Mr Russell-Moyle then?
Well, I think it was wrong what he did. I mean, party discipline's not my, you know, it's above my pay grade.
But what would you advocate?
I would advocate, let people, this is a really sensitive issue, this issue that people have been talking about people changing their gender and what the law should be and how that should be recognised. There are really strong views on it. What I would advocate here is let people give their views. Let's not be cruel or mean to anyone in this debate, and let's try and work through what is...
I think Russell-Moyle was actually cruel and mean. On Rosie Duffield, is it transphobic to say that only women have a cervix?
Look, I'm not going to use, you know, a term like transphobic. Rosie Duffield's entitled to say what she should say.
But would you agree with her that only women can have a cervix?
Look,
and why are you reluctant to say that? I mean, I'm asking you a biological fact, really, to confirm a biological fact.
Look, of course that's the case, but there's the reason this is in politics at the moment is we've got a Gender Recognition Act which recognises that for some people, during the course of their life, they will want to change their gender.
But are you comfortable with 16-year-olds choosing their own gender?
Well, we've said we're not comfortable with that. Now, I think politics has to work this through, has to do it in a sensitive way. As I say, it has to do it without being cruel or mean to anyone, and in a way that people can express their views, not through kind of, you can't say that, and this outrage here.
But what you're advocating, if I may say, Mr McFadden, is a degree more kindness in politics, which is not what I think we witnessed from your Labour colleagues in the week, perhaps. Is that fair to say? Fair to conclude on that note?
I'm always for kindness in life.
Well, thank you very much for coming into the studio today. Thank you. Let's go back to the People's Panel there now in Southend. Olivia, what does everyone make of it there?
Hello, Camilla. Yes, so Diana, you heard those two interviews, first with James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary, and then Pat McFadden, the Shadow Chief Secretary of the Treasury. And what did you make of what they had to say?
To be honest, they're not really making any sense to me. It's just all blasé, and they just don't seem to be making any headway. They're not being honest and straightforward with us at all.
Do you worry about the Conservative Party being just engulfed in all these scandals? So do you think James Cleverly's response to that was adequate?
No, I don't believe the response was adequate. I mean, there is, as we've ultimately said, everything is broken and they're not doing anything to fix it. It's just plaster after plaster, just covering everything over. So, no, I'm not very happy with it at all.
Thank you. And Edward, you were concerned about tax, and Camilla asked the Foreign Secretary about that. Do you think his response did it fill you with confidence?
I mean, we're running into some very difficult times. It's likely we're going to head into recessionary conditions this year. Tax is very high. Government borrowing is extremely high at the moment, at a time of record high interest rates. So the government will automatically be spending far more money on interest servicing this year than ever before. There just doesn't seem to be much interest in making sure that every taxpayer's pound is spent efficiently. Nobody's really talking about reforming fundamentally the public services. The answer is still spend more money, spend more money. Well, the money's got to come from somewhere. It's got to be earned. If the government's spending, then it's coming out of our pockets.
Absolutely, thank you very much, Edward. And Matt, I saw you nodding there. You're a Conservative voter, you're feeling a bit disillusioned. Did what people say there change your mind in any way?
Not at all. It was another fudge interview. I used to have a lot of time for James Cleverly, actually, and I used to respect him. The issue for me is Rishi Sunak does not have a mandate to run the country. He was put before the party members with Liz Truss more than 6 months ago. The party membership decided to reject him, and then for whatever reason we now have him in control because they didn't want to put it to the party members again. I fundamentally think the only way to resolve the issues we have in this country is a complete change of management at the top, and we need a general election.
Well, thank you very much. Strong words from our panel there. For now, back to you, Camilla, in the studio.
Great job, Olivia. Thank you so much. That was Olivia there with the People's Panel in Southend. If you do want to apply to a future show's People Panel, bearing in mind we're going to go around the UK, log on to gbnews.uk/panel. Now, I'm delighted to be joined now by Sir Richard Dearlove, former Chief of MI6. You were there for 5 years, Sir Richard.
Correct.
Thank you very much for coming into the studio
Pleasure.
this morning. I mean, your former brief couldn't be busier at the moment with fears for the future of Ukraine, fears about China, fears, again, about Britain and the safety of Britons in the face of various terror threats. Let's begin with Ukraine, because this story about the Germans' refusal to give these Leopard tanks over to the Ukrainians, and indeed to sanction the licensing of other countries giving their tanks, I think is giving a lot of people extreme cause for concern. Are the Germans reneging on their responsibilities as a NATO member to a European partner?
Well, they haven't reneged on them yet. I think it's important to say that. I think I would describe Germany as being at a crossroads, and they're hesitating. They do not yet know which way to go, because there's no good shouting at Germany over this issue. I think one has to understand the problems that Germany has in facing really a fundamental change in its foreign policy, in its attitude to international security. I mean, if they decide not to supply Leopards to Ukraine, or if they, as it were, embargo leopards from those that they've supplied them to. Because
Poland, for instance, which is willing to give
There are
leopards.
2,000 of these machines.
Yes.
In the ownership of various European countries, and at the moment they can't exploit them because the Germans won't agree. So, I mean, it may well be that they will agree for others to supply them, but then there's the question of logistics, supply, repair. So the Germans, whatever, would have a role to play, and I think they're just faced with a very tough decision. I think if you look carefully at what Pistorius, the new defence minister, actually said yesterday, he didn't say they weren't going to. I mean, I did listen very carefully to his wording, and I think he probably indicated that there would be some sort of agreement. But, I mean, the Germans have this anxiety over, I guess, escalation.
Yeah, although the French have also been quite reluctant to step up with military support, haven't they?
Well, the French have always defined their security policy slightly differently from everybody else. They've traditionally had a closer relationship with Russia in some areas than other European states. And they've been slow to step up to the plate. I think recently you have actually seen a change in France's attitude. I mean, Macron's now declared an increase in French defence expenditure. I mean, Scholz has, but hasn't really done anything about it. But I think in France's case, they are now shifting their ground quite significantly.
What's your assessment and analysis of Putin right now? You know, there's a debate going on about whether he's mad, bad, or both. How do you see this playing out for him particularly?
Well, I think this is a conflict that Putin politically in Russia cannot afford to lose. So if he does lose, and I think one would have to reflect on what lose means in this particular case, then I think his political future is probably over, finished. But, you know, the mechanisms for getting rid of a leader in Russia are not clear. I think he's just in a very vulnerable situation. I mean, it's a disastrous conflict he's entered into. It's going from bad to worse. He's probably faced with another call-up. That clearly is deeply unpopular in Russia. There must be massive tensions within the leadership group inside the Kremlin. There must be massive tensions socially across Russia over this whole issue. Yes. I mean, it's a mess.
And yet there doesn't seem to be a high likelihood of him being deposed.
I just don't think we can tell. I think deposed... I mean, I rashly predicted last year that on the grounds of probably his health, he'd get shuffled off into a sanatorium and would disappear, and that then you would just have probably a continuation of the same regime in someone else's hands. I still think that that's a possibility. I mean, there's clearly something wrong with him.
What do you mean by that? Psychologically, physically?
Physically, I think, I mean, so many people have, I'm not a clinician, but clinicians I know analysing his movements, there's something wrong with him.
Yes.
And maybe that is affecting his political judgment as well.
We're living through such volatile times. What would you characterise as being the, say, three main threats to Britain right now?
Well, I think we've got the whole cyber issue, because we're not in a direct conflict. So let's say our opponents and our enemies can make great trouble through attacking our cyber infrastructure.
And you're most worried about the Russians and the Chinese?
Well, the Russians and the Chinese obviously use that to a significant degree. I mean, if we listen carefully to what, for example, the Director General of the Security Service, and to an extent GCHQ, the Communications Intercept Centre in Cheltenham, have said, I mean, they put China at the top of the list. And I recently had a very interesting conversation with the former head of CIA and head of NSA, General Hayden. And I mean, he basically agreed. He said, China, China, China.
Right.
In the medium to longer term. And that's been articulated here nationally in the UK in quite an emphatic fashion.
And has that been heightened by China's circling of Taiwan, or is that just a general, they have the technology at their fingertips with which to use against us?
I think it's more fundamental than that. You know, if you look at the 20th Party Congress, if you look at the results of that, if you look at the documentation, I mean, China is set on a road to attempt to dominate globally by 2149, you know, in halfway through this century. So the idea that, you know, they sit there in a sort of benign state, believing in peaceful coexistence, is actually not. It's rubbish.
Yes.
So China has these ambitions.
So we have the cyber threat.
You have the cyber threat coming from China and from Russia. You have obviously the sort of destabilization that a major war on the European continent and the risks of escalation. So, I mean, that is clearly for the UK in particular, because, you know, we are a significant European power, a very direct threat. We still have the terrorist problem in the background. And I think that also is something we have to worry about, maybe not quite to the same degree.
When you speak of terror, are you talking about Islamic fundamentalism? Are you talking about, because there's been an increased focus on it, far-right extremism? Is there an equivalence there?
Personally, I don't think there is. I think the major threat comes from Islamic fundamentalist terrorism and the degree to which there are organizations, I mean, organized terrorist movements. So ISIS is still in existence. There's the remnants, but still potent remnants of Al-Qaeda.
Yes.
Okay, there are also the problem of lone wolves, and I think that problem of lone wolf terrorists stretches across right-wing extremism and Islamic fundamentalists. But in terms of conspiratorial organizations that threaten society generally across Western countries, then I think you probably have to say that's primarily an Islamist terrorist threat. And I think the unpublished review of the PREVENT strategy, which William Shawcross
the PREVENT strategy.
I think that comes probably to that conclusion. I mean, it's still being, as it were, debated before it's publicly released.
I know you have theories on COVID.
Yes, I do.
Do you think that it was a Wuhan lab leak? And do you think it was deliberate?
I don't think it was deliberate, but I do think it was a leak from gain-of-function experiments conducted in the Wuhan Institute. And I think now, frankly, the evidence for that is, I would say, overwhelming. The problem is it's not proof. I mean, you're looking at a range of possibilities, and my understanding now from talking to virologists who know and understand this issue and have looked at it closely is the chances of it being zoonotic, jumping from animals into humans,
from a wet market,
is very, very small.
But what can we ever do about it? How can we ever get answers to this? We never will we?
I don't think we'll get a definitive answer. I think the scientific answer now, in a range of probabilities, is that it was a leak from the Institute. I think it underlines how dangerous gain-of-function experiments are in any lab. And maybe this is the debate that we need to have, is the extent of international control over this sort of biological experimentation.
I also want to ask you about Brexit and whether you think Brexit has made the UK safer or not.
Well, I have strong views on that too. I don't think it's made it less safe, let's put it like that. Look, the UK is the leading security and intelligence nation in what was the European Union. We never, as it were, exercised our influence and our resources, as it were, in this area through Brussels. We dealt bilaterally with every single European state, and every single European state had a very important relationship with the UK in this area because we were a European leader. The arrangements of Brexit haven't changed that at all.
No.
Because we didn't do it through Brussels, we did it nationally. And I mean, there are one or two areas where European legislation applied, like data exchange. But generally speaking, I don't think Brexit has, as it were, affected the UK's safety in the respect that you're asking
And
me.
just a brief word on this one. The compromising of political mobile phones, this idea that Liz Truss was hacked by the Russians on several occasions. Are politicians just not up to speed with how to protect themselves from this kind of thing?
Well, I think, you know, there is the issue of convenience, there's the issue of speed of communication, there's the vulnerability of modern technology. If you want to, as it were, protect yourself, you've got to use very sophisticated stuff. I mean, look, I've been out of office for a long time, but in the days when I was still a Crown servant, ciphered phones, mobile phones existed, but they were extremely clunky.
Yes.
And awkward to use, difficult to use. And in a real world, you know, you can't expect politicians to rely on this stuff. I think things have moved on massively now, but you have to be very disciplined in the way that you behave. And I mean, politicians lead such fast lives. So much is happening continuously. I think it's almost
They have
impossible.
to be abreast of it.
Yeah.
A moment of levity, if we can, because we've had a very serious chat over the last 10 minutes. And you mentioned, oh, we're near to where your office is.
Well, it used to be.
And I said, I remember it being blown up on a Bond film. I mean, as a former head of MI6, is it a busman's holiday to watch spy movies and to be involved in... There's a lot of appetite for it on the telly, or do you just avoid all that? And is it even representative of what life's really like in MI6?
Well, it depends what sort of movies and what sort of books you're talking about. I mean, some of them are realistic, some of them are completely fantastic.
All right, then fast last question. Favourite Bond?
I guess it, you know, someone of my generation, it's James, isn't it? I mean, very Sean.
Sean Connery, of course, the original
It's the
Bond.
very original one, which, you know, we just didn't even think of him as Sean Connery any longer.
No, we just knew him as Bond, James Bond.
That's why I said James.
So Richard Dearlove, thank you very much for joining me this
Camilla,
morning.
a
Lovely
pleasure.
to speak
Thank
to
you
you.
very much indeed.
Now here's the news headlines with Aaron Armstrong.
Hi there, it is 10:30. I'm Aaron Armstrong in the GB newsroom. Labour's calling for an investigation into claims the BBC chairman helped Boris Johnson arrange a loan of up to £800,000 weeks before the then Prime Minister recommended him for the job. It follows a report in the Sunday Times that claims that the Tory donor Richard Sharp was involved in talks about financing Mr Johnson's lifestyle in Downing Street when he found himself in financial difficulty in 2020. A spokesperson for the former Prime Minister has dismissed the report as rubbish. Richard Sharp insists there was no conflict of interest. Meanwhile, the Tory party chairman remains under pressure after admitting he paid a penalty as part of a multi-million pound tax settlement. Nadeem Zahawi says HMRC accepted he made a careless but not deliberate error in relation to the sale of shares in the polling company he founded. Labour has called his position untenable, but the Foreign Secretary James Cleverly says he believes Nadeem Zahawi has paid his taxes.
He has been a very successful entrepreneur who built a business from nothing, employing hundreds of people, possibly even 1,000 or more people, and has successfully contributed to the British economy. And he paid tax, the business paid tax, his employees paid tax. And HMRC said that he was careless in the administration of his tax affairs, but he is now fully up to date with the taxes that he owes.
Several people are understood to be injured following a shooting during Chinese New Year celebrations in California. A warning, the following will contain some flashing images. Police and emergency services have been responding to an incident in Monterey Park near Los Angeles where thousands of people had gathered. It's not yet clear how many people have been injured or if anyone has been killed. Buckingham Palace has revealed the details for the coronation later this year. The historic event will take place at Westminster Abbey on the 6th of May. A concert will then be held at Westminster Castle the following day, featuring what the palace have called global music icons. Thousands of events are expected to take place all over the UK, with a bank holiday declared for Monday the 8th. TV, online, and DAB plus radio, this is GB News.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Mark Stein. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
We are GB News, the People's Channel. Why not take us home with you by visiting the GB News shop at gbnews.store. You'll find all the official merchandise, a really good present actually for yourself, your friends or your family.
We ship across the UK mainland at no extra cost. GB News, the People's Channel.
Here on GB News Live, we'll be keeping you in the picture, finding out what's happening across the country and finding out why it matters to you. We'll have the facts fast with our team of reporters and specialist correspondents. Wherever it's happening, we'll be there from 12 noon on TV, radio and online. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday on GB News, it's Bev Turner Today from 10 a.m. We're going to be here for you, our GB News family, to keep you up to date, but also make you smile.
The guy went from puberty to adultery.
And I can't wait to bring a few of my own opinions.
I have no time for cultural totalitarianism.
We'll engage in passionate, but always polite debate, with your thoughts and opinions at the centre of it all. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
Welcome back. Well, we've spent the week being horrified and appalled by the crimes of David Carrick, the rapist cop. I'm joined now by Palm Sandu, former Chief Superintendent at the Met. Palm, thank you very much for joining me this morning. You were a woman in the Met. Do you recognise this characterisation of the Met being deeply misogynistic, of having rogue officers in its midst?
Good morning. One of the things I really do need to say is that the majority of police officers are good, caring individuals, and they're there for the right reasons. And they turn up day in, day out, and they will be there to support people in crisis. What has happened is that too many officers, corrupt individuals, have been allowed to join policing and then remain in policing. And this isn't new. This is something that's been going on for years. And even in 2015 and then last year in November, the Constabulary for Policing issued a report to say that there was something wrong with the vetting and that there was something wrong with the culture that enables these sort of individuals to be attracted to policing and then stay in policing.
I think as well, isn't there fear and alarm over this idea of other officers turning a blind eye to officers in their midst who have got this reputation for treating women appallingly and nicknaming them rather than actually calling them out and saying, hang on, these people need to be disciplined?
Absolutely. And the fact that David Carrick had a nickname, he would have earned that nickname. His behaviour would have been such that people would have thought that nickname fitted him. But the problem that exists in policing, and something that really does need to be looked at quickly, is that the culture doesn't allow people to whistleblow. There's no support network. And as a woman, I've experienced this firsthand. If you then call out that bad behaviour, you then become the victim. You then have false allegations made against you. You press that emergency button when you're out in the street and people aren't going to turn up.
Well, explain that a bit more. There isn't the procedure in place. What do you mean? Because there isn't an HR department per se? Or if you're reporting bad behaviour, who are you reporting it to?
Right. You'd normally do is you'd report it to your line manager or you'd report it to the complaints departments. But what happens is you then become isolated. The team will turn against you and say, well, you're a grass or you told tales. And they hide behind this label of banter. They call it banter, but they cross the line again and again. And then you're told, well, you're not part of the team, you can't take a joke, and that's how they hide it. And so you have to be really brave to call out this sort of behaviour. And when you do, you're not supported. Your development suffers, your promotion suffers, and even going into work on a day-to-day basis is really challenging.
And do you think a lot of women in the Met feel like this still today?
I know that this behaviour is still carrying on today. I'm still a mentor. You know, I wrote about my experiences in my book, but this is still happening now. And it hasn't changed, and it's not strong enough. And even today, I was reading through the Commissioner's new 9-point plan, and I welcome the plan, but it's not quick enough. A 2-year plan. We need something now. And my fear is about a woman or a man, anybody who's in crisis out there in the street who hesitates to pick the phone up. I want them to be able to pick the phone up and know that they're going to get a good officer turn up to help them.
In general, the attitude towards the police force, I mean, the reputation of the police force is at an all-time low. That must depress you as a former senior officer.
I think it's really shocking how trust and confidence has suffered. And I'm hoping that that trust and confidence can be rebuilt. It's going to take time, and it is going to be a listening experience. And when I talk about support for whistleblowers, there also needs to be support for men and women who are reporting rapes. The rape conviction rate in this country is between 1.3 and 1.5%. That's appallingly low. So that means that we haven't got the safeguarding right. It means that we're not looking after people who are brave enough to report these types of crimes.
But finally, Palm, do you think that actually stories like Carrick's might put off rape victims from reporting their crimes because they just think that the police are the same as the rest of them?
Absolutely. And people are going to hesitate and they will not report. And that's why that trust and confidence has to be rebuilt, and it has to be done quickly. The complaints, the vetting, it needs to be taken away from policing and given to an independent body so that they can be looked at independently. And one day you could be working with somebody and engaged in that banter, then the next day you're investigating them. The police are marking their own homework, and that can't be allowed to continue.
Thank you very, very much indeed. That's Palm Sandu there joining me this morning. Now, let me just read out a few emails. Jenni says, Labour can say whatever they think will win them the election. They are not scrutinised, and history shows they always leave us worse off. Sarah says, Rishi Sunak thinks the public is stupid. He patronises and talks down to them all the time, as does Jeremy Hunt. Taxes can and should be cut, despite what they both say. Kathleen adds, please look at the archive pictures of Starmer and Corbyn in the back of a car without seat belts on. Maybe we'll investigate that. Finally, Graham, he says, solve the shortage of nurses overnight by bringing in nursing apprenticeships. Get them out of uni and onto the wards. Or to be fair, I think they do nursing apprenticeships, but perhaps get some clarification on that point in a moment. Now, I'm joined for Generation Gap today by Barry Gardiner, Labour MP for Brent North, and Jess Gill, who is a political commentator. Thank you for joining me. Do you know what generation you're in, Barry?
Well, I think you've put me in the sort of young to middle, but...
Yeah, well, Barry, I think you might be a... I don't want to say, are you an X, a Z? Maybe you know. What do you think? Are you a millennial?
I'm a Zoomer, a Gen Z, a member of Gen Z.
Right, all right. Well, look, there is a gap between you.
I'm a boomer and you're a Zoomer.
Boomer to Zoomer, that's what we like on Generation Gap. So we're going to talk about strikes. We've obviously got this February the 1st date coming. It's like a national day of striking. Just to go through the list, teachers, uni staff, train drivers, civil servants. Then we're expecting more NHS workers to go on strike and ambulance workers again after that February the 1st date. Barry, this striking is holding the country to ransom. It's not fair. It's not right. Some of the people in these positions of authority shouldn't be able to go on strike at all.
You've just listed teachers, ambulance drivers, nurses. Nurses have never been on strike before, I think in my lifetime. So many people in this country feel that they're not being treated fairly and that they are not being rewarded properly for the work that they do. Now, you and I, Camilla, were out on our doorsteps and I'm sure Jess was as well, applauding those people, these essential workers during the pandemic, and now you're saying that they're holding the country to ransom and that they're the enemy within. No,
well, the police can't strike, the nurses can.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. But of course, what the nurses did and what the ambulance drivers did was they made sure that the essential services of the ambulance care for emergency calls were all provided. All of that was done. The point is this, we are seeing people, nurses, teachers, actually having to go to food banks to feed their kids. That's wrong.
OK, Jess,
and,
let's
and we
bring you
need a
in now.
fair society.
As the Zoomer here, presumably you are pro the worker. You want strikes to happen because you're young and engaged in the political scene and you support what Barry's saying.
Well, for one, I am pro-worker, but I'm also pro-consumer, and I think it's completely unfair on the British public. I think it's a lose-lose situation either way. I don't think nurses deserve a lower pay, or any of these sectors, but also it's unfair on the British public. And I think it's not the workers who are at fault for this. If your pay was decreased by inflation, you'd want it to be increased. I think it's actually the politicians over here who are responsible for this.
Yes.
And I think that's the issue. I think we need to realise who's to blame here, and it's the government.
Yeah, well, look,
politicians are all to blame.
Jess and I absolutely agree, because the government could have intervened in the negotiations. They actually blocked the rail companies from having the negotiations. They put that 2% limit in place, and they said they weren't allowed to move beyond it. Now, in a situation where we've got food inflation now almost at 17%, this is just too much. And I think Jess is right. The government is to blame here.
But is it not a bit of a kind of old Labour, old school, your generation argument to be kind of being Scargill-esque about strikes when you've got a young woman here in Jess saying, well, this is, and it's a perfectly cogent argument, well, it might be fair to the workers on strike, but it isn't fair to the workers who need to go to the hospital that day or need to use the trains or need to use essential services.
You know, what I found really interesting about the way in which the reporting of the strikes has happened is at the beginning, a lot of reporters went out and did a vox pop. And the public almost universally were saying, look, of course, it is going to be inconvenient for me, but I understand why they're doing it.
Jess isn't saying that, Jess.
I mean, personally, it's caused me inconvenience. I know cousins who are in education, whether that be university or at secondary school, and they're inconvenienced by this. We've had just lockdown a couple of years back. They're still suffering the consequences of that. I have elder family members who are reliant on the NHS and they will suffer the consequences of it. While I don't blame the workers, I still think that's the consequence of it. People are suffering in this country.
Yeah, they are.
So it's wrong. It's wrong to grind people who are just starting out in life, like Jess and her friends. They're trying to get about, to do a good day's work, to not kind of have this work-shy tag that is often afflicted on the young. And yet at every turn, they're being stifled by people putting their own interests first.
No, look, I don't think that's fair, because actually young people are nurses. Young people are going into all of these professions, all of these, jobs. And what we see and what young people feel at the moment, and I can't speak for Jess, but many people that I talk to, young people that I talk to, are worried about the insecurity in work.
Okay.
It's the 0 hours contracts that bother them. They want a good job. They want a job, not necessarily for life, but they want a career path. They want to know that they're going to be properly rewarded.
We'll have to leave it there. Thank you, Jess. Thank you very much, Barry, for that cross-generational chat. Now, coming up, we're going to be speaking to a Holocaust survivor with an extraordinary story to tell. We'll see you next.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
And the national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us. We are GB News, right across the nation. You can get us on television, on radio, on digital. We're absolutely everywhere.
Amazing! You see, amazing!
You remind me of me in the European Parliament. But here's the most important bit. We are not part of the mainstream establishment. We think and speak just like you do. We are the People's Channel.
Magnificent. That's really, really thoughtful.
Come and join us on GB News, the People's News Channel.
My name's Tom Harwood, and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today.
I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Join me, Nana Akua, Saturday and Sunday afternoons on GB News. Expect fiery debate and passionate discussion as me and my panel tackle some of the biggest topics hitting the headlines. It's a place for everyone's opinion. No one gets cancelled, but no one gets an easy ride.
Oh, she's on it today!
Be ready for conversations that are fierce, frank, and of course, fun. Every Saturday and Sunday afternoon from 4 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel.
Welcome back. Well, it's Holocaust Memorial Day on Friday, and I'm joined by Wendy Holden now, who's author of this extraordinary book, Born Survivors, which is about the story of 3 Holocaust survivors, including, I'm delighted to say, Eva Clark, who joins me now. Now, just very briefly, ladies, I brought you in because you gave a talk at my daughter's school, and she said it was the best talk she'd ever given. It was hugely inspirational, and therefore I wanted to ask you about it directly on this sofa. Eva, your story, I mean, you shouldn't really be here. Encapsulate your story for us, if you can, in the short time available.
Right. My father was German, my mother was Czech. They met in Prague. They were young, able to work, and so they were amongst the first people to be sent to Theresienstadt, the first camp in Czechoslovakia. They were there for 3 years, which was a very unusually long period of time, and then my father was sent to Auschwitz, and incredibly my mother actually volunteered to follow him the very next day because she had no idea where he'd been sent. So being the eternal optimist, she thought they would survive, but she never ever saw my father again. And she found out after the war that he had been shot on the death march on the 18th of January 1945, and Auschwitz was liberated on the 27th.
So just days before?
Yes, yes, yeah. My mother became pregnant in Terezin, which was illegal. The sexes were segregated. And she said, well, it happened. And it happened twice. It was very dangerous, but it happened twice. And when she was pregnant with my brother, and the Germans found out, they said that when the baby was born, he or she would have to be handed over to be killed.
By the Gestapo, obviously.
Yeah. When he was born in February of 1944, his name was Jiří, which means George, but he actually died of pneumonia 2 months later. And his death saved my life and my mother's life, because had they arrived in Auschwitz, had she arrived in Auschwitz holding my brother in her arms, they would have both been killed. And then she arrived in Auschwitz later, and she was pregnant again with me, but nobody knew. She knew, but nobody else knew and didn't show. So again, she lived to see another day.
So she managed to disguise the pregnancy for the entire time, and then the circumstances of your birth.
Yes. My mother was in a slave labour camp for 6 months in Germany, and then they were evacuated to, they were on a train that consisted of coal wagons for 17 days with no food, no water. And at the end of those 17 days, they arrived in a place called Mauthausen, which is in Austria near Linz. And when my mother saw the name at the station, she had such a shock because, as opposed to when she'd arrived in Auschwitz not knowing what that was, this time she knew. And she said the shock was so great that she always thought that it possibly provoked the onset of labour. And she gave birth to me on a cart in the open air. And
without any help at all?
Oh, none. Help. There was a Nazi officer standing near her, and he said to her, "Du kannst weiter schreien," which means you can carry on screaming. Presumably she had been. And she always said she was screaming not only because she was in labour, but because she thought she was about to die. But we both survived the experience. I was born, I didn't move, I didn't breathe. And we always say that there are 3 reasons why we survived, and the first is a very chilling one. On the 28th of April 1945, the Nazis had run out of gas for the gas chamber. Well, my birthday was 29th.
Goodness
So
me.
presumably had the train arrived on the 26th or 27th, I wouldn't be talking to you now. The second indirect reason why we survived is because on the 30th of April, Hitler committed suicide.
Yes.
And the last and the best reason why we survived is because on the 5th of May, the American army liberated the camp. My mother reckons she wouldn't have lasted much longer. They think I weighed 3 pounds. I was wrapped in paper.
And presumably your mother as well was very undernourished. I
Very
think she
undernourished.
weighed 5 stone, even though
5
she was
stone.
pregnant. Wendy, let me bring you in, because it's not just Eva's story that you've managed to capture in this astonishing book. There are 2 other born survivors.
Yes.
And you managed to track them down and then unite them. How on earth did you do that?
Well, I first came across the story in 2013 when I read an obituary of a woman who had died in Canada in her 80s, who'd had a baby that had been taken away and murdered. And it got me thinking, have any babies survived the Holocaust? And after a fair amount of research, I came across Eva's name. And when I read about her and her mother, I would have travelled to Australia to see them.
Yes.
But she lives in Cambridge,
Yes.
and I live in Suffolk, so
Yes.
it was perfect. And I spent the day with her. It was incredibly moving. And at the end of the day, I asked if she would do me the great privilege of writing her mother's story. And she reached out and touched my arm and said, "I've been waiting for you for 70 years." And I told her I believed her story was unique, and it was quite funny because she was a little indignant. She goes, "Well, I thought so too, but 5 years ago I discovered that there were 2 others whose mothers had been on the self-same journey, from Auschwitz to slave labour to Mauthausen, and they had been reunited through the reunion of the American veterans who
Yes.
liberated them."
And then you managed to reunite them with
Well,
Eva.
they had met, and
yes.
then we managed to get together. Once I knew about them, I realised I had to encompass all 3, because I call them siblings of the heart. They've become so close, and I couldn't miss one without the other.
And how did it feel to meet those people who had been in exactly the same situation you, and basically been born in these extraordinarily difficult circumstances and survived it?
Right, well, I have to take all the credit because I found them.
Fair play
I
to
found
you.
them 5 years before by chance via the American Veterans Organisation. It's a long story.
Yes.
And so we met 5 years before in Mauthausen, when it was the last time that the American veterans were going there, because they were very elderly by that stage. And it was quite remarkable. We sat in one cafe all day, talking about our mothers, laughing and crying and talking about them. And I was so glad that they both came to Cambridge the following year in 2011, and they met my mother, who was the only one of the 3 mothers who was still alive.
Amazing.
And they were so pleased to meet her. And because we all happen to be only children, so we feel we are siblings. And they came into our house, and my mother, because my mother was living with us then, and my mother said, "You're my children."
That is lovely. I mean, a happy ending to such a difficult situation. Just ask you briefly before we finish, Eva, with regard to Holocaust Memorial Day on Friday, there does seem to have been a resurgence of anti-Semitism, not just in Britain but around the world. Briefly, do you think enough is being done to educate school children and people about the importance of the Holocaust, but also to try and expel what remains to be anti-Jew sentiment?
That's a very big question.
I know.
It is very sad that there is this resurgence, and I think, yes, we all have a responsibility to try to educate as many young people as possible to show what is, in quotes, the logical outcome of racism and prejudice.
Well, I think the phrase that we always use when it comes to Holocaust Memorial Day is never forget. And this extraordinary story, just to say the book again, is called Born Survivor. Wendy and Eva, what a story you've had to tell, and thank you so much for joining us here on the show this morning. Well, it's been a very packed day. We've enjoyed the show. Do sign up for our People's Panel, and please do join me next week. Goodbye.